I'm going to run it down to that one.
Some ketchup?
There we go. You know what? I keep forgetting my clicker. It's Diane. It's over on the table between our two chairs. If you don't mind, if you could bring it back, it makes it a little easier on me. Okay.
Okay.
In order to follow these non-writing prophets that a lot of scholars don't consider as non-writing prophets, I felt we needed to include some of the Jewish and Israelite history, what was going on when they were uh, making their pronouncements. So today's study, as a matter of fact, thank you. Today's studies, and not just today's study, but there may be 3 parts to or 4 parts to this. I know there's going to be 3, but there may be 4 parts to this. But hey, what else are we going to do on the Sabbath other than study God's word? So I'm kind of combining a study of the book of Kings, First, Second, and also First and Second Chronicles a little bit. As we talk about different prophets that came on the scene and made their pronouncement. So I hope that's okay with you all, and I'm really enjoying going back through these books that I have not looked at in a long time. And King Jeroboam is going to play a big part in what we're going to discuss today. The scholars say that there are 4 non-writing prophets: Samuel, Nathan, Elijah, and Elisha. And I think I've mentioned this before. I don't know where they get off saying that. I found 12. Now, if they had said there are 4 major non-writing prophets, okay. On the other hand, I think that we have evidence that Samuel and Nathan both did a lot of writing. So anyway, but it won't be till part 3 next week that we began talking about the greatest of the non-writing prophets that most people acknowledge, and that's the prophet Elijah. So today we're going to get rolling here, and the first prophet we're going to talk about is Ahijah. Let me see if I got my clicker working. Yep. Okay. So we are just before the split of Israel and Judah, and Elijah the Shilonite, the prophet, he was in the days of Solomon. Solomon was still king. And that's another reason why I'm doing it this way, is because in order to get it chronological, I can't help it, but I have to look at the stuff that's happening in First and Second Kings and so on in order to, try to keep this chronological. Anyway, one of the things that's interesting about Ahijah is that he was the father of one of the worst kings in the northern kingdom, Baasha, I think. And Baasha came to power by murdering the previous king, Nadab. And if you all remember, and we're not going to get into a lot of that, but some kings lasted like 15 minutes. Some lasted a couple of weeks, some lasted a month, and then some lasted for a few years till somebody killed them off to take over their place. And one of the things that I found rather, I hate to say it's humorous because people are killing people, but some of these Levites didn't seem to be able to control their children. Aaron, if you remember, two of his sons, Eli, two of his sons, and now we run into Ahijah, whose son murdered another king so he could take over the kingship. So, there was a lot of stuff, particularly in the northern 10 tribes, that just wasn't something you wanted to be involved in. Now, many of these non-writing prophets pop up here and there. They make a prophetical announcement and then they disappear. It's all we ever hear of them again. Ahijah is sort of like that, but he does show up a couple of places, but he has a pretty important job to do. And the first thing that he does is to tell Jeroboam that he's going to be king, and that he's going to be king over 10 of the tribes of Israel. It starts off, as you all can read there, it came about that time when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem and I again apologize, I'm going to be sneezing through, excuse me, throughout this study today. It came about that the prophet Ahijah, the Shilonite, found Jeroboam on the road. And Ahijah says Ahijah had clothed himself with a new cloak. I think the new cloak was on Jeroboam. I don't know where that came from. But anyway, Ahijah.
The cloak was on Ahijah. And he took his own coat off and tore it up.
His own cloak, okay. I don't know how I've never noticed that. I've read this 1,000 times. So it was his.
Well, I read ahead of you, and I would be like, well, wait a minute. If Jeroboam had a new coat, and then Ahijah shows up, takes the coat off of him and rips it up, I would imagine there'd be a little bit of a fist fight there in the field. At least that would be my logical thought. Like, you mugged me, took my coat, ripped it up, and handed me pieces and tell me I'm going to be king. That's kind of weird.
Yeah. Good. Yeah. So this is Ahijah's cloak. Ahijah took his own cloak and tore it into 12 pieces, and he gave Jeroboam 10 of them. And he says, "Thus says the Lord God of Israel." When we read those words, Yahweh Elohim, when it says, "Thus says," this is a big deal. It's a real big deal. And he tells Ahijah, he tells Jeroboam that he's going to get 10 tribes in the north, and Solomon is going to get 2 tribes. And in verse 32, it says he'll have 1 tribe, but we know that Benjamin stayed in the south, and the Levites, some were in the north and some were in the south. And we'll talk about them a little bit because there's some information in Chronicles that talks about when Jeroboam started doing the horrible stuff that he started doing, the Levites and the loyal people to God went south. They said, we're not putting up with this. And anyway, it says that Rehoboam will only have 1 tribe because of the promise that God had made to David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I've chosen, because they've forsaken me and have worshipped Astaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Chemosh, and so on. So the southern tribes, Judah had already started worshiping these false gods, these false Elohim. Mostly, I would presume, because of Solomon's wives, who were allowed to worship and bring in the idols and set up groves to worship their false gods.
Yeah, can I interject on that thought, Skip?
Sure.
which I think puts to rest the entire notion that diversity is our strength. No, it's not.
Good point. It is not. It's better if we can hang together. What is it? What they used to say?
Well, Benjamin Franklin said it's better to hang together, or for surely we shall hang separately.
Yeah, and there's a lot of wisdom in that. So, okay, so this is what Ahijah's job was initially, to tell Jeroboam the nation of Israel is going to split, and you're going to get part of it, and Rehoboam is going to get part of it. And so in verse 37, it says, I'm going to take you and I'm going to let you reign over these 10 tribes. And these words right here got him in trouble. To all that your soul desires. And we know what, I'm sure everybody remembers what Jeroboam did. And he should be king over Israel. And remember now, from now on, when we say Israel, we're talking about the northern 10 tribes. And when we say Judah, we're talking about the southern tribes. And it shall be, if you will hearken to all that I command you. And guess what? He didn't. But we'll get into that. But if you will hearken to all that I command you, and will walk in my ways and do what's right in my sight, and keep my statutes and commandments, and be like David. And we all know David had personal problems. He sinned, but David never let the nation worship other gods. And that is the big difference between David and other kings. And he says, I'll be with you if you will continue to obey me and be like David. And I'll build you a sure house, just like I built for David. I wonder here, if God is telling Jeroboam, look, I'll keep you two nations separately, and I'll build you a sure house like I built for David, and your descendants will reign and be over the northern 10 tribes, if you will be like David. And verse 39, he says, now look, I don't like what's going on, and I'm going to afflict the seed of David, but not forever. And we know that eventually Christ came out of David's lineage. Solomon sought therefore to kill Jeroboam. He knew about this prophecy. And Jeroboam arose and fled into Egypt. Now this is while Solomon is still the king. Okay, and so we're now talking about, let me look at my, we are talking about around 933 BC when this is going on. 900 years before Jesus Christ was born. All right. So the king didn't listen to the people. Now this is talking about Rehoboam. For it was a turn of events from Yahweh that he might establish his word, which Yahweh spoke through Ahijah the Shilonite to Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Okay. So now, 1 Kings chapter 12. Yeah, okay. God's word through Ahijah came to pass. There was a split. 1 Kings 12. So Israel rebelled against the house of David unto this day. It's the northern tribes rebelled against the southern tribes. And it came to pass when all Israel heard that Jeroboam was come again, and he must have been a popular guy. Everybody knew Jeroboam. That they sent and they called him and they made him king over all Israel, based, the words of Ahijah. And there was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. Now, we also know that Benjamin, of course, says it a little bit in verse 21. When Rehoboam was come to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah along with Benjamin and he assembled 180,000 men, warriors, to fight against the house of Israel. They were going to have a civil war. We had one in this country. Didn't work out very well. Thousands of men died, and women also. So they were going to go up and they were going to fight with Israel and bring the nation back to Rehoboam. And so another prophet comes in. One of these, again, short term, says something and then disappears. Although I think Shemaiah also we may find a little bit more. It says, but the word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, the prophet, man of God. Remember, prophet, seer, man of God are all terms used for prophets. And he said, whoa, go talk to Rehoboam and say, this isn't going to happen. You must not go up and fight against your relatives, your brethren, the sons of Israel. I want, everybody needs to go home, relax, take a chill pill, have a glass of wine, for this thing has come from me. I'm the one that split the nation of Israel into two. It has come to me. So they listened. It's kind of rare, isn't it, when people listen to the word of God, and they returned and went their way according to the word of God. God said, no, you're not going to fight against each other. Now, this is also mentioned, I didn't put the scriptures in here, but it's also mentioned in 2 Chronicles chapter 11. As you all know, a lot of what's in Chronicles is also in 1st and 2nd Kings. Now, more about Shemaiah here. When the kingdom of Rehoboam was established and strong, he and all Israel with him forsook the law of the Lord. Okay, so these are the southern tribes, and they forsook the law of Yahweh. And it came about in his 5th year. In the 5th year, Rehoboam was the king because they'd been unfaithful to the Lord. We have a tendency, or I do, to think, well, the northern tribes went into captivity long before the southern tribes did, so all the disobeying was being done up in the north. No. It came about in King Rehoboam's 5th year because they'd been unfaithful to Yahweh, that Shishak, the king of Egypt, came up to war against Jerusalem and had a whole bunch of chariots and horsemen, and the people who came with him from Egypt were without number. There were thousands of them, and they captured the fortified cities of Judah and came as far as Jerusalem. And Shemaiah the prophet came to Rehoboam and said, look, the princes of Judah who had gathered at Jerusalem because of Shishak, because they knew he was coming, and they're gathering their warlike together. And he said, thus says Yahweh. Okay, there we are again. You have forsaken me, so I'm putting you in the hands of Shishak. But they humbled themselves and said, Yahweh is righteous. And when the Lord saw that they humbled themselves, Shemaiah came back and said the words of God. Okay, wait, they have humbled themselves, so I will not destroy them. Sort of like with Jonah and Nineveh. And as a matter of fact, it's very similar to Jonah and Nineveh because Judah for a while did humble themselves and obeyed God. And he says, I'm going to grant them some measure of deliverance, and my wrath shall not be poured out on Jerusalem. In other words, they're not going to be destroyed, but they're going to become his slaves so that they may learn the difference between my service and the service of the kingdoms of the other countries. Now, in Second Chronicles, it mentions something, and we've talked about these other books before. You know, God did not put every book that was written by every prophet in the Bible. You know, we read about the book of Enoch. Well, here's one. We've got the book of Shemaiah. It says, now the acts of Rehoboam from first to last, are they not written in the records of Shemaiah the prophet? Well, we don't, and Edo the seer, according to the genealogical enrollment, we don't have that book. It's not in the scriptures. And but there were wars between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continually. I like the word skirmishes between them. There wasn't a civil war, but there were skirmishes between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continually. And then Rehoboam died. And he was buried in the city of David, and his son Ahijah became king in his place. Okay, so now we're gonna kind of concentrate a little bit more on Israel. The problems are just about to start in Israel, and they are major. This would be again around 900, 930 BC, so you'll get the chronology here. About 50 years before the first writing prophet came on the scene. Now, as we continue our discussion of the non-writing prophets, let's take a look at Jeroboam, because he is such an important part, in a bad way, of what was going on in the northern tribes. It was at his direction that the problems of the northern tribes began and continued with almost all the kings of Israel. If you go through a list of the kings of Israel, you'll have bad king, bad king, bad king, good king, bad king, bad king, bad king, good king. You know, it's very rare that there was a good king that ruled over the nation of Israel. But Jeroboam did not listen to the words of the Lord. Remember here when Shemaiah was telling him, it shall be, if you will hearken to all that I command you, if you'll walk in my ways, if you'll do what's right in my sight, if you'll keep my statutes and commandments like David. You know, I read this earlier. I'm just going back over this. I'll build you a sure house. Jeroboam had it made. God was with him. God said, all you have to do is obey me and make sure the people obey me, and don't let the idol worship and all of that stuff happen. But Jeroboam did exactly the opposite. 1 Kings 12:25. First thing he did, he built Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim. And that's where he lived. That's where his palace was. And he went out from there and built Penuel. And Jeroboam said this. Now, if we don't do something to stop it, the people that I rule over are going to go back and return to the house of David. So what did Jeroboam do? Jeroboam did not believe God. God sent him a prophet. Said, look, if you keep your act straight, you keep the people straight, everything will be great. But Jeroboam said, oh, here's what's going to happen. Verse 27. If they go back to Jerusalem and offer sacrifices in the house of Yahweh at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will return to their Lord. Even though God had told him, I'm with you. All you have to do is obey me. And he said, the heart of this people will return to their king Rehoboam of Judah, and they're going to come and kill me. So the king consulted and made 2 golden calves. And he said to them, it's too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, just like what happened at Mount Sinai. And you know, if you read into this, what you find is that they didn't believe they were worshiping those. Well, it's going to be calves and goats, but they were representative of the God that they were worshiping. But God had made all kinds of statements that you don't go after these idols. And he said, it's too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Behold your gods, O Israel, that brought you up from the land of Egypt. And so he set one in Bethel and the other in Dan. Now I've got a map here. If you look all the way up at the top, you see Dan. It's kind of all by itself. Then if you'll come down, if you see Benjamin right here, Beth, I think it was Bethel. Yeah, Bethel was right on the, I put the wrong map in here, but Bethel is right here. It's right on the border. I'm sorry, right here. There's Bethel. Right on the border of Ephraim, one of the northern tribes, and Benjamin, one of the southern tribes. So what he did was he set up a place to worship in Dan up on the northern, so people, from, the people from here in the middle could go either way, and the people in the south could go to Bethel. And they didn't have to go to Jerusalem. They didn't have to go to Judah to worship. So, give me a second.
Well, while you're fidgeting, just a thought, Skip. What I find fascinating, remembering your study from last week and this week, is that you have a people. If you look at what the northern king was consumed with, it was of course politics, and he wasn't listening to the voice of the Lord. But what I find fascinating, in terms of what the function of these prophets that you presented so far, last week and this week, is that you have a situation where because of Solomon's wives, you had a nation of God that began to go into wokeness. They go into diversity. They began to accept other gods and other ideologies which were not from the Lord. And as a result of all of that is what is the consequences of what happened. You can have the northern tribes, 10 tribes break away, and then you have the southern tribes, because that's where it began with Solomon and his wives. They end up having the Pharaoh of Egypt come against them, and then they humble themselves, but he puts them under the slavery of that which they wanted to serve in the first place. And he wanted them to experience what slavery was like, servitude of another nation versus servitude to the Lord, to experience the difference. And I just find it interesting that in all of this, that these prophets are being sent to kind of explain the consequences of what the people have done and what's going to come about as a result of their disobedience. And that seems to be, at least based on what you presented so far and the way you presented it, that seems to be the function of what these prophets were, to basically announce this is the consequences of what you people have done, and this is what it's going to bring, and it's not going to be pleasant. So anyway, I just thoughts that spewed up in my mind as you were fidgeting for whatever it is you needed there.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that they they were going to be slaves of Shishak, and like you said, they'll find out what it's like to be a slave nation to this other king, as opposed to being a slave to God. A doulos to God. Well, we're in the Old Testament. I can't use that.
But it's what they wanted too. It's funny. God's consistent. He always gives the people over to what their desires are. And before that judgment was pronounced, they were already serving those other gods of because of what they explained. That the prophet explained, because the people were. He lists all the gods that these people were following after. It makes you wonder: was Shishak, were they liking the gods of Egypt, and then he just gave them over to slavery, to that which they were already kind of in spirit of serving, instead of the Lord, which I find very interesting.
Yeah. Now, thank you, Michael. In verse 28 here, it says the king consulted and made 2 golden calves. Well, other places, and I think I have these scriptures. He made 1 golden calf, and then he made, and I'm going to hold off saying what it was, but basically goat, sort of goat, and he says, this thing became a sin. And I've got some scriptures later on that talk 14 different times. God names this the sin of Jeroboam. And it was the downfall of the nation of Israel, without a doubt, what Jeroboam has done here. This thing became a sin. Why? For the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. They went up to Dan and they worshiped this golden calf, or worshiped the representation of God, or however you want to put it. And in verse 31, it says he made houses on the high places, and he made priests from among all the people who were not the sons of Levi. Now, I've got some scriptures in a minute where the King James Version says it one way. It says they made priests of the lowest of the people. But I checked 12 translations, and only the King James Version and the Geneva Bible, which I think both of them were translated from the same copy, or the same. What am I trying to say, Arthur? This is your area. Manuscript. Thank you, Mark. Okay. All right. So
I have can you go back to the previous slide for a second? Oh, golden calves. Okay. So then, go ahead, go forward one. So let's remember Dan in the far north is in this area where the caves of the pagans to access the underworld. This is all close to the same area. Way up there.
yeah, well,
That's right at the close, you're getting up way up there close to that area where they, of Bashan, where that was the focal point of the worship of the false gods and the access to the underworld.
where Christ named it the gates of hell, right?
Right.
Interesting. I missed that. Thank you, Mark. All right, let's see.
It's not the exact same spot, but I think it's close. I don't know. I think that so you got Bashan over there on the right below Dan.
Yeah.
And I think the mountain is a little bit farther north.
Okay. Well, there's Mount Hermon up there. I don't know if that's not the one you're talking about, though, is it?
I'm over 60. I can't remember.
Yeah, I got that same disease. Okay, thanks. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that at all. All right. Now, this thing became a sin because Jeroboam set up these places of worship so that the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan, and that may be why they mentioned that that is close to the area where there was so much pagan um, worship up there. It says he made houses on high places and made priests from among all the people who were not of the sons of Levi. Now remember, the King James Version, and I may have this a little bit later, the King James Version and the Geneva Version both mention that he made priests of the lowest of the people. And I think we had a conversation about that last week, that, who were the lowest of the people? Well, all these other translations don't put it that way. All these other translations say that they made priests from among all the people who were not the sons of Levi. What did God say? God said, the descendants of Levi, particularly Aaron, are going to be my priests. And Jeroboam said, no. And then there's a reason why. And I've got a scripture about that in a minute that's really kind of interesting. So then the next thing that he did, or at the same time, he instituted a feast in the 8th month on the 15th day. He didn't want them going back to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. He made up a whole new feast. I don't know if there was a name for it or not. I haven't ever read it. But he instituted a feast in the 8th month. Now, we don't know what else he changed. It seems to me, just logic, that if he changed the date of the Feast of Tabernacles, he changed a whole bunch of other stuff too. And I've heard speculation that he changed the Sabbath to the first day of the week and so on. Don't doubt that for a minute, but we don't have scriptural evidence. But anyway, he instituted a feast in the 8th month, like the feast which is in Judah, like the Feast of Tabernacles. And he went up to yeah.
Oh, I was going to say something, Skip. It's historical evidence. It's fascinating to me and how this all transpired. It came back to basically one big flaw that the original Israelites, they traveled to the desert, and only 2 of that generation were allowed to take the ones that were left, the new generation, into the Holy Land. But he gave one important instruction. He listed all these nations that they were to completely destroy and to wipe off of the face of the earth. But some of them they didn't. So over time, these same nations, there was a purpose he wanted them taking them out. It was because these habits, the way they worshiped their gods, little by little infiltrated the Israelites, and it took down the whole northern tribe and eventually the second tribe. But not following through and doing exactly as he told them to do caused all this.
Yeah, good point. All right, now, again, it says here in verse 32, thus he did in Bethel. Okay, so he's got one in Dan, he's got one in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves which he had made. And we've got a little different wording here in a minute. And he stationed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. Now remember, I guess it's the other way. There. Remember, Bethel is right on the border of the southern tribes. I mean, it's just right there, and it made it real simple for people to stop. Why should I have to walk all the way down to Jerusalem, which isn't even on this map? Why should I have to go all the way down to Jerusalem when I can just stop in Bethel and worship God? And so, all right, let's see. Here's okay. So he set up these altars, I suppose, pagan temples in Dan and in Bethel. But guess what began to happen? A good thing began to happen. There aren't very many good things that we read about in this, but here's what happened. The Levites left their pasture lands and their property and came to Judah. We're not putting up with this. We're going south and we're going to live in the land of Judah and we're going to be in Jerusalem. For Jeroboam and his sons had excluded them from serving as priests of the Lord. Why? Because they were going to insist on obeying God. And Jeroboam wasn't going to have, he'd set up these false places of worship. And so he can't have Levites serving as priests because they're going to tell the people, don't do that. And here's verse 15. He set up priests of his own for the high places. And this is where, and I think I have the scriptures, but we'll see in a minute. But in the King James and the the other Bible says that he set up priests of the lowest of the people. Well, that's not an accurate translation. Sorry. He set up priests of his own for the high places, for the satyrs, and for the calves which he made. Now, I tried to get this in order, but it looks like, no, there it is. Okay. Only the King James and the Geneva Bible of the 12 translations I checked mentions the lowest of the people. The rest of them, including here's in 2 Chronicles, it just said he set up priests from his own people who were not Levites. And so what begins to happen is that the Levites and the people who were loyal to God, who were living in the north, came south. And it says, those from all the tribes of Israel who set their hearts on seeking Yahweh Elohim of Israel followed them to Jerusalem. They followed the priests to sacrifice to Yahweh Elohim of their fathers, to the Lord God of their fathers.
Skip,
Yeah, Jim.
another thing that probably additionally encouraged the Levites to go south is they were out of a job.
That's true. Good point. Yep. That is true. So let's see. This was kind of difficult for me to get all set up in my notes the way I wanted it. In 1 Kings 12:31, here's the way it's put in the NASB. And he made houses on high places and made priests from among all the people who were not sons of Levi. And then in the Complete Jewish Bible says he also set up temples on the high places and made Kohanim. That's actually it's the Greek and Hebrew word basically that means priests. So it made priests from among all the people, even though they were not descended from Levi. A strict violation. I mean, a complete violation of God's law. In 2 Chronicles, it says that the Levites and the faithful people left Israel for 3 years, right here. They strengthened the kingdom of Judah as they came down from the north, the faithful believers and the Levites, and they supported Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, for 3 years. For they walked in the way of David and Solomon for 3 years. And I wonder, why 3 years? And I looked in some of the commentaries, and what they said, and it's speculation, but what they said was that by 3 years they'd all gone back to the south. There weren't any left up there. So it says they walked in the way of David and Solomon for 3 years. Now, also in, let's see, yeah, in 2 Chronicles 11:15, got to find it. It says he set up priests of his own for the high places, for the satyrs and for the calves which he had made. Anybody know what a satyr is? Satyr. If you go back and you look at pictures,
It's a goat, isn't it?
yeah, it's a half goat, half man. But yeah, it technically it's a goat. So he set up. Do I have that? For the satyrs and the calves which he had made. So he's got both goats or half goat, half man, and calves that he set up in Dan and Bethel. And then it says in 2 Chronicles 15 in the Complete Jewish Bible, good translation here. He said he had appointed for himself priests for the high places and for the images of goat demons and calves that he had made. So with the Levites gone, I have to stop here just a second if y'all don't mind. I have to put in eye drops every 4 hours in my eyes that I had cataract surgery. So, okay. Sorry about that.
What's interesting is that
Yeah.
I think what's interesting is that satyrs are part of Greek and Roman mythology also. You
Yes.
see how those gods transcend themselves on down through the millennia and never really kind of go away.
You know, I'm glad you said that. I must have looked at 100 different pictures or drawings, not pictures, and statues of these satyrs. And I hate to be, no, I don't. I'm just going to throw it out there. I couldn't put the pictures on here because almost all of them that I saw were in some kind of sexual position. And they were males. So I'll just leave that to your imagination. But I couldn't, I didn't feel like I needed to put those on here. Okay.
Oh, if you want to see a modern day version of a satyr, they have it now up right next to the National Cathedral, the statue of Baphomet, or Baphomet, I don't know how you pronounce it. But there's your satyr right there, and it has two children looking up to it as if he's the god. So nothing new under the sun. Even in our era and our age, we're now erecting, statues and idols to these satyr goat gods. So it goes all the way back.
Now, Michael, come on. We have to be fair. We have to show both sides.
I'm done being fair. I'm done. I'm going to stand for the Lord. I don't care what repercussions come at this point. I'm fed up.
Yeah, no, I didn't know that was there. Yeah.
Isn't there a half horse, half man in mythology, and also is that related?
Yeah, that's a centaur. That's a centaur. Yes,
Centaur.
That's also Greek and Roman.
Yeah, if you look into the mythology, you get all of these crazy looking half horse, half man, half goat, half man. In this particular case, I think he's talking about a half goat, half man, or maybe just a goat. You know, it's not clear, but you know, we know that it's not something that Jeroboam should have done, and he's gotten himself in even more trouble. Let's see. Okay, also in 2 Chronicles 11:15, it says that the idols Jeroboam had made were both calves and satyrs. Okay, I've already done that. He set up to, okay. So with the Levites gone, what does Jeroboam do?
Can I throw something else in there about the goat?
Yeah.
You know, over the last number of years, we've had numerous conversations about Leviticus 16 and the Day of Atonement. If one reads on into chapter 17, it says, I don't know, you might be interested in turning there. If not, I can just summarize what it says.
I can get there. Leviticus 17.
Yeah.
All right, just a second. Let me throw up right there. That'll make it generally a little larger.
So the humanly placed.
Where am I going again, Mark? I'm sorry.
Leviticus 17.
As you can tell, I got my fingers on the wrong. Any particular verse?
Just start with verse 1.
Okay, now let me enlarge this.
So the humanly placed subhead for this chapter is the place of sacrifice. And this is a section where God instructs Moses to tell people that to tell Aaron, his sons, and all the people not to sacrifice things wherever they want to. It's interesting, this reasoning, or how this develops. So in verse 1, it says, tell Aaron and his sons, all the people of Israel, and say to them, this is the thing the Lord has commanded. If anyone in the house of Israel kills an ox or lamb or a goat in the camp, or kills it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to offer it as a gift to the Lord in front of the tabernacle, blood guilt shall be imputed on that man. So you see, this is all about sacrifices being pointed to one place to have it done. So, and we remember there are other commands, you know, everybody shouldn't do what they want to do, but they should all bring it to the tabernacle to be sacrificed. In verse 5 says, to this end, the people of Israel may bring their sacrifices that they sacrifice in the open field, that they may bring them to Yahweh, the Lord, to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and sacrifice them as sacrifices of peace offerings. And in verse 7, it says, so they shall no more sacrifice their sacrifices to goat demons. After whom
What
they
translation are you in?
English Standard Version.
All right, let me. I don't know what I just did. Oh, I missed.
So that's verse 7.
All right, verse 7, and I want to bring down here the Bibles, English Standard Version. Okay. Now I gotta make it bigger so we can see it. There, okay.
So the point is that that even when Israel was leaving Egypt, we know they had problems. We know that they had problems obeying God, doing what he said, etc. And here's an indication that this was something done in the wider Near East. This is a cultural thing that was all around them. They were affected by all of these things. All of these idols were things that the nations did around them. And here is one instance of a warning that the people should come to a place where the legitimate worship of God was taking place, and a certain direction should take place amongst the people. This is why the Levites were getting chased out of the northern tribes. They were probably saying, well, you know, there was some, certainly the vast majority of them seemed like they weren't going to compromise with Jeroboam. But the other part is they were probably being chased out of the northern tribes by the people who were turning quickly to a different way. And this is one feature of what was going on many years later, hundreds of years later.
Does verse 7 seem to say that the Israelites were already sacrificing to goat demons?
Well, there's two trains of thoughts, and that one of them is, yes, there could have been some surreptitious things like that. They just come out of Egypt, right?
Yeah.
They had only recently come out of Egypt. What was going on in Egypt? What was the cultural setting? You have to remember that they were immersed in a culture that was filled with false gods. And we've already been through this. You've aptly done this in the past about how the plagues were against all the gods of Egypt. And they were being taken out of that culture that they had grown up with, grown into, were a part of, and were being directed in a different way. There were cultural influences all over the place. God was removing a people, taking them to the promised land because they were his people, chosen way back right after the Tower of Babel, where God disinherited the nations, gave them over to the false gods, and he chose Abraham and then his family, and he was drawing them back out of Egypt and taking them to Jerusalem. And then, of course, you know, they had problems there. So it's all kind of interrelated, but associated with the fact of what God was doing with the people that he was drawing, and why we even have prophets to give warning messages, not necessarily eschatological messages. Prophetic message is a message from God that's instructive.
For right then.
Yeah.
Not necessarily for
not necessarily. I mean, you learn lessons. Certainly, you learn lessons, but you have to think about who it was written to and what was going on in the culture around them, and why it was written. And the fact of the matter is that these prophets we're talking about right now were telling us a story of what took place, how Jeroboam moved things and twisted things and turned people away from God. And that's why, you know, time after time after time, as you said a little while ago, we hear that ringing voice of the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and
So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it.
I have many times wondered why the Levites were chosen to be the priests, to be the teachers, if you will. And, you know, looking at verse 7, it really does seem like there were Israelites that were sacrificing to goat demons, and maybe it was the Israelites that were telling them, no, can't do that. You know, I mean, we don't have pure speculation, but
Well, I mentioned there was one thought that was that this was written because this was going on. Another thought that is out there is that this is an edited scripture or set of scriptures inserted later as instructive purposes because of the way Israel went.
yeah.
But it is definitely part of the Torah, instructive law about how Israel should live.
Yeah, and you know, remember the Sabbath day. Don't forget it, and it's something from the past. You know, remember, and they were there. You know, I know people think 400 years. I think it was more like 200 or 250, but that's irrelevant. And they had forgotten. You know, think about it. In 200 years, how much stuff are you going to forget, especially if you're being influenced by the people that are around you? So anyway, thanks, Mark. That's
About what we've forgotten in 20 or 30 years.
Yeah, look at America today.
Yep.
You know, 200 years ago, what a different country we had.
That's exactly right. And we're changing all the time. Okay. Well,
Well,
thanks. Go ahead.
the judges were 400 years, weren't they? And then you've got David and Solomon. So they weren't just out of Egypt.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was talking about while they were in Egypt. That it was 200 or 250 years. But yeah.
But I find like Josiah's reign interesting, and he closed down all the Levites unless they were in Jerusalem because of corruption. They were in the high places, and they mixed paganism with the true religion, and they were sort of corrupted in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something God makes very clear. He doesn't, you know, I mean, goodness gracious, he told them when they went into Canaan, I want you to wipe out all of those people. Children, women, men, wipe out everybody, because if you don't, you're not going to like what happens in a few hundred years. And they didn't, you know, though they did some, but you know, they didn't quite a bit. So, okay, now, thank you. I think this is where we are. Thanks, Mark. He set up priests that were not Levites. Okay, and here, I don't know if this is the biggest mistake that Jeroboam made. As a matter of fact, he made so many bad mistakes. I don't think you can nail one down and say, "Oh, this is the one that did it." But this brought a prophet out of the woodworks when he did this. So when Jeroboam got rid of the somebody, Mark, I guess said that they ran the Levites off, and that's probably right. Then he went up to the altar which he had made in Bethel. Now remember, Bethel's the one in the south. This is right on the border. This is where the southern tribes can see what's going on. I don't know if there was a method to his madness here or what, but he went up to the altar which he had made in Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month. Okay, so he's making sacrifices, or a sacrifice, on a holy day, if you will, that he's made up, just purely made it up. So it's not holy. Even in the month which he had devised in his own heart, which we know is the 8th month, and he instituted a feast for the sons of Israel and went up to the altar to burn incense. This is a big, big mistake. And God sent a prophet. Now, Jeroboam had broken several of God's laws very quickly after he became king of the northern tribes. He says that he feared that Israel would return to Judah and follow Rehoboam. You know, maybe that's right. Maybe he just wanted to be the big man in charge. But Judah,
Wait,
yeah.
wait. That thought you just gave.
Huh?
I'm just kind of curious. If God sends a prophet to tell you that you are going to be made king of 10 tribes of Israel, it's amazing how the hubris of man suddenly gets to fearing that I'm going to lose my political power. He seemed to have somehow quickly forgotten that God is the one that gave him and set things up because of the sins that were coming out of Solomon and his wives and those things, that he was given the kingship of the northern 10 tribes. And somewhere along the way, all of a sudden, he seemed to have forgotten how the kingdom was given to him. And all of a sudden, now I have to rely on my own power and my own political savvy to keep myself safe from my people going back to, that which was established, originally, because then I lose my power. Just a thought based on what you just said there.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. And what that tells us is that Jeroboam was not a faithful believer in God. He didn't believe him. God sent him a prophet, like what you just said, who took his own clothes off, as I just learned, and ripped them up and said, here's what's going to happen. Now, here's what's going to happen, but I want you to obey me, and I want your people to obey me. So I think that's an indication that Jeroboam was not a faithful believer in God. I think that's pretty obvious. Okay.
Well,
Yeah.
Skip,
Yeah, Jim.
and he went up to the altar to burn incense.
Yep.
So he was acting as a priest king.
Yep.
And there are only two priest kings mentioned in the Bible: Jesus and Melchizedek.
Which could be the same person, but may not be.
Which, yeah, could well be the same person.
Yeah. We don't know.
But I mean, he not only changed the holy days, he put himself up to be, if you will, the representative of God or whatever God he was worshiping. So he just compounded it by burning the incense himself.
Yeah, and it was serious enough that God sent a prophet to him. And this is, I think you all.
He became his own abomination that makes. I said, yeah, he became his own abomination that makes desolate in a way.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Just like what happened with the temple later on. And I think you all know that I have a really weird sense of humor. And this happens to be one of my favorite parts of the Bible, one of the little stories that I just love. And I might tell you all, if I'm watching a movie, I love revenge movies. And I can't wait until the revenge, that somebody's mistreated. And, I'm watching the movie and I go, oh, I can't believe he's treating her like that or whatever. And then they get even. And I know that probably shows that I have a little weakness in my Christian self. But I love this story. Jeroboam broke several of God's laws very quickly after he became priest, because he says that he feared that they would go back. Well, here we go. What did he do wrong initially? He made 2 golden calves. Actually, it was calves and goats. But anyway, he set up 1 calf for worship in Bethel and 1 in Dan. 2, he caused or he allowed the people of Israel to worship the calves as representatives of Yahweh. 3, he made houses on high places for worship. Now, that's not all by itself wrong, but you add the other 2 things to it, and it's a real problem. This is a biggie right here. He made priests from other families, from families other than Levi. He changed the dates of the feast and possibly other holy days. We don't know that, but and then in the 6th one is he went to the altar in Bethel to offer sacrifices himself, as Jim just mentioned. And it was on the border of Benjamin. I personally can't help but think he did it on purpose. He went there on purpose to show the people that he could be the big dog. So I can't really help but wonder if he chose Bethel because it was so close to Jerusalem. Now, the complete biblical library commentary, which I think is really good most of the time, says the charge brought against him was threefold. I came up with 6. They came up with 3, but mine are in there. First, he set up the golden calves at Dan and Bethel. Second, he made priests from among the people who were not the sons of Levi. And thirdly, he established his harvest feast, not on the 15th day of the 7th month, which is the Feast of Tabernacles, but on the 15th day of the 8th month. And that's the way that the complete biblical library takes that. So now here's that map I've shown you before, but you can see Dan is at the northernmost point in Israel. And remember, when I say Israel, I'm talking about the 10 tribes that were given to Jeroboam to lead. And then the other is the southern border down here, right on the border of Benjamin and Ephraim, right on the border of the northern 10 and the southern 2. It's apparent that it was Jeroboam's plan to make it easy for anyone living in Israel to worship at his altars and not have to go down to Judah. And Bethel was on the border of Benjamin and Ephraim, and it was one of the sites that Jeroboam set up as an altar so the Israelites would not feel, and that when I say Israelites, I'm talking about the northern tribe people, wouldn't feel they had to travel all the way to Jerusalem to sacrifice and observe. I don't have God's holy days here. I've got Jeroboam's holy days. And God didn't stand for it. God is a very patient God, and thank God he is. He didn't stand for this. He sent a prophet to Jeroboam. And here's something interesting. He sent a prophet to Jeroboam not from Israel, but from Judah, which I find interesting. I'm not surprised. Could no prophet in Israel be found? At this time, I'm going to say probably not. So one day, Jeroboam, the big king, the big dog, went to Bethel to offer sacrifices. And God didn't even name this prophet. We don't know who it is. We don't know what his name is. It says, behold, there came a man of God out of Judah, not out of Israel, by the word of Yahweh. And he came to Bethel. And Jeroboam was standing there by the altar to burn incense. And he cried against the altar in the word of Yahweh. This is the man of God. Said, "Oh, altar, altar." And he pronounces a prophecy that's going to come true down the road. but he pronounces to the altar, which I thought was kind of interesting. He says, "Oh, altar, altar, thus says Yahweh, behold," and he names the child. "Behold, a child shall be born to the house of David, Josiah by name." I think Rod mentioned Josiah a while ago. "And upon you shall he offer the priests of the high places that burn incense on you, and men's bones shall be burnt." He's not going to offer bulls and goats. He's going to offer your priests. He's going to have them killed. And I don't know if this is a metaphor or if he literally does it. But anyway, he shall offer the priests of the high places that burn incense on you, and men's bones shall be burned on you. It sounds like it's more than a metaphor. And we don't even know the name of this prophet. And he gave a sign the same day. And he said, "This is the sign which Yahweh has spoken. When this happens, the altar is going to be split in two." And there is a scripture later on. I don't have it in today's notes. "And the ashes that are on it shall be poured out." Now, there was a certain process that the Levites were supposed to do with the ashes that were in these altars. And I can't remember exactly what it was. One of you all want to throw out there? Does anybody know? There was a process. Anyway. And he goes on, and this is one of my favorite parts. And when King Jeroboam heard the saying of the man of God, which cried against the altar, he stuck his arm out, he pointed at the guy and said, "Lay hold on him." And his arm froze. God gave him a stroke or something. We don't know, exactly what happened. But when he stuck his arm out and said, "Lay hold on that prophet," his hand, which he put forth against him, dried up. So he couldn't pull it in again. I mean, there he is standing there with his arm stuck out. And the altar was split. And the ashes poured out from the altar. I'd forgotten this happens right now. According to the sign which the man of God, again an unnamed prophet, had given by the word of Yahweh. And the king answered, and Jeroboam said, "Hey, please entreat your God and pray for me. And let me have my hand back. Let me have my arm back." And the man of God prayed to Yahweh, and the king's hand was restored him again and became as it was before. Shows how merciful God can be if someone repents. Now, I'm not sure Jeroboam was repenting. I'm not sure that God wasn't making a point.
Yeah, Skip.
Yeah, Jim.
And this is, I'm sure I've said it 1,000 times before. The king answered and said, "Entreat the face of Yahweh, your God."
Yeah.
Not Yahweh. Not Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh, your Elohim.
Elohim. Yeah, your Elohim. Going back to the studies we've had, where we talked about the many Elohim that are on this earth that are not God's Elohim.
Yeah, and one of the problems with virtually all the translations that use the Lord is that they put in "the" in front of it for me. Yeah. And I have trouble doing it, but I want to take that out and just say Jehovah, because it's not the Lord as in a Lord in any sense. It's his name. It's
Yeah.
the person.
Yeah.
Or the personal being, whatever you want to call it. But God's a person.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Good point.
enough of my rant.
But that's a good point. That's a good point. If you look in the text, when it's translated like this in the English, the article "the" is not in the text. But that's sometimes the case. Obviously, they had to do that when they used that term.
Yeah, and apparently Jeroboam knows that the man of God's God is different from his and has power. Now, why this didn't get his attention, I don't know. Ego, I'm sure, pride. But apparently the king knew that the prophet was speaking for the Most High God. Wouldn't you think? Okay, so God fixed his hand back, and then now there's a sad event here that's about to happen, dealing with this unnamed prophet. In 1 Kings 13:7, Jeroboam said to the man of God, "Come home with me and refresh yourself, and I'll give you a reward." But the man of God said to Jeroboam, "If you were to give me half your kingdom, I wouldn't go with you, nor would I eat bread or drink water in this place. For it was commanded me by the word of Yahweh, saying, don't eat any bread, don't drink any water, don't go the same way which you came." So he went another way and didn't return by the way which he came to Bethel. And I spent a little bit of time trying to find the place where he was told that, and I didn't spend enough time, so I don't know where the prophet is told this. And I don't even know if it's in there. But anyway, God told him, don't go back the same way. Don't go to anybody's house and eat bread or drink water, and don't go the same way which you came. So he obeyed for a little while, and he didn't return by the way which he came to Bethel. But here's one of the strange things in the Bible, and I don't know, maybe this was a test, but it says an old prophet. Again, we don't know who this is. An old prophet was living in Bethel. Where? Northern 10 tribes. He was living in Bethel. Wasn't one of them, that wasn't a prophet that returned to Judah. He was living in Bethel. And his sons came and told him, "You're not going to believe what just happened." And told him what words that the prophet had spoken. And their father said, "Well, which way did he go? Where'd he go?" And his sons had they'd seen the way that he left. And so the old prophet says to his sons, "Get the donkey ready for me. I'm going to find him." So they saddled the donkey for him, and he rode away on it. Now I'm assuming that the prophet that talked to Jeroboam is walking, so he's caught up with him. So he went after the man of God and found him, resting, sitting under an oak tree. He was not doing anything wrong that God had told him. And so the old prophet says to him, "Are you the man of God who came from Judah?" And he said, "Yep, that's me." And he said, "Well, I want you to come home with me and eat bread. I want to feed you. I want to reward you." And the unnamed prophet said, "I can't." I can't return with you. I can't go with you. I can't eat bread or drink water with you in this place. And I don't have to read the whole thing, but you all know what happened. What happened was the old prophet lied to him. And he says, look, I'm a prophet too. And an angel spoke to me and said, bring him back to your house. And the prophet that spoke to Jeroboam believed him. And he went back to his house. And so I think it's the old prophet. Now, it came about as they were sitting down at the table that the word of Yahweh came to the prophet, to the old prophet, who prophesied and said, you've messed up. You didn't do what God told you to do. And you didn't observe the commandment which Yahweh Elohim told you. And so it goes on that, he knows he's in trouble. And so he went back on the road and a lion met him and killed him. And his body was thrown on the road with the donkey standing beside it. The lion also was standing beside the body. So he's on a donkey at this particular time. It's kind of a sad story. I don't know if it was a test. God throws things out every once in a while to test you.
We're not told whose prophet the old prophet was. It just says an old prophet lived in Bethel. But it's interesting, just as you got to that. Let's see, what verse was I looking at? 21. Thus says Yahweh, because you have disobeyed the word of Yahweh and have not kept the command that Yahweh your Elohim commanded you. He emphasized that's part of the emphasize that they're Yahweh, the name of your Elohim, the mighty Elohim, the one gave you that command, and we don't know who this other person was a prophet of. Just says an old prophet.
Well, that's true. I hadn't thought about that. That's a good point, Mark.
One thing there in verse 21, though, he said, "Thus says Yahweh, for as much as you've disobeyed." So whether he was or wasn't a prophet of Yahweh, at least for that moment, apparently he was, because apparently God gave him this prophecy, the old prophet.
Yeah. God started out this prophecy telling him, I want you to go down and tell Jeroboam this, and then I want you to go back a different way and don't stop and eat with anybody. This is the Almighty God that's telling the prophet all the way down to and including right here where he is. This is the real God telling him, you disobeyed me. Y'all, anything else?
It's a strange occurrence.
It is.
And Balaam also spoke some truth, even though his heart was not with God.
Yeah. No, that's true. Okay, so now.
Well, I think. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Just a thought since we're on the subject here. I think it gives us an indication that, these are just men who, even though they may be prophets of the Lord, they can still be influenced by and do the bidding of other Elohim that are not the Yahweh Elohim. And so it's interesting because it says here the word of the Lord came to the prophet who lied to the man of God and tells him, because you disobeyed the command of the Lord. And I know it sounds a little strange, but I think it gets to the point of saying, well, God, why would the Most High allow an old prophet to lie to another man of God to get him to deceive him, to get him to come back and do something which God told him not to do? And that's where you get the whole idea, well, was it a test? And I like where Mark's thoughts were, that this man may originally have been speaking from another Elohim and not the Most High. And then the word of the Lord comes to the one that deceived him. So again, I don't want to impute that God caused someone to lie, but there might have been other Elohim involved in this situation. So thanks, Mark.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so now Jeroboam began to reign in Israel about 920 BC. Solomon was dead. Rehoboam was the king of the south, and God had instituted, whatever the word I'm looking for, Jeroboam to be king over the northern tribes. And we mentioned this earlier. I think a couple of people have mentioned it, about how Jeroboam's allowing Israel to sin became a byword. The phrase sins of Jeroboam, and some of the places, like Mark said, it says the son of Nebat, caused Israel to sin and so on. But it's used, this sins of Jeroboam is used 14 times in Kings, culminating in what is said in 2 Kings 17. That's the last time that it's mentioned. And the most damning of all of those comments was spoken of King Ahab. And I've got all of these, and we can take a look at it. Here are the 14 times that it's mentioned. And it gives 2 Kings 17 gives us a synopsis of why both Israel and Judah were taken into captivity. And we may go through that today. I think we'll have plenty of time. So here's the first time, and I probably should have brought these on separately, but I'm not. But in 1 Kings 14, it says, he shall give Israel up, speaking of God, because of the sins of Jeroboam, who did sin and who made Israel to sin. And it seems like that who made Israel to sin is worse than who did sin. David sinned, but he didn't make Israel to sin. He didn't let Israel sin. And in the next one, because of the sins of Jeroboam, which he sinned and which he made Israel to sin. And the next one, it came to pass, and this is my favorite. This tells you something about Ahab and Jezebel. And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he took to wife Jezebel. I mean, all of the bad things that Jeroboam did were light things compared to him marrying Jezebel, who went and served Baal and worshiped him, and Jezebel was just terrible. And I always laugh when I read this, as if it had been a light thing that he married Jezebel. Anyway, I'm sorry. I just, that one just blows me away. And in 2 Kings 3:3, nevertheless, he, and these are all kings in the north. Nevertheless, he cleaved to the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which made Israel to sin. That's the way Mark quoted it a while ago. And he didn't depart from it. And I didn't put context down. I'm just showing you all these different times. And 2 Kings 10:29, however, from the sins of Jeroboam, who made Israel sin, Jehu didn't depart from that. And he kept worshiping the golden calves and goats that were in Bethel and Dan. And then the next one, Jehu, who was a bad king, took no heed to walk in the law of Yahweh. He took no heed to walk in the law. He's the king of Israel, folks, the king of God's people. Although by now they may not be God's people. For he departed not from the sins of Jeroboam. 2 Kings 13:2. This king did that which was evil in the sight of Yahweh and followed the sins of Jeroboam. 2 Kings 13:11. I mean, I don't need to read all of those. Y'all can look them up yourselves if you want to. But all of these kings of Israel did evil in the sight of Yahweh and departed not from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. All of these say that. And here's some more. Here's 4 more.
Every single time you get government normalizing sin or promoting sin, and it becomes entrenched in the culture, this is what you get, and that's how God is able to impute sin upon the entire nation and points it back to the originator, in this case, the king. But I mean, government itself, once it gets involved in doing this, whereas David did not. His sin was just his own personal sin, and he suffered consequences for it, but he didn't normalize that sin upon the rest of the nation. Say, hey, it's okay. You can go ahead and take your neighbor's wife and kill the husband. That's okay. He didn't do that. Whereas as these these evil kings did, and it became normalized, and then no one wanted to go back and undo which was normalized. And you can look at our modern day culture where we've done the same thing with divorce. We've done it with promiscuity. Now we're doing homosexuality, and now pedophilia is being normalized. So you see where this goes. That once it's established that it's okay to do these sins, it's very difficult for a culture to undo them because they become normalized.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the last one of those, and I put in here. I didn't know how far along we would get, and so I want to go over something that I have a note that if we don't have time, we'll do it next week. But I think we got plenty of time, and this is a good synopsis of what caused Israel's problems. And it begins in 2 Kings chapter 17. And I'm not going to read it verbatim, but it's 3 pages long. But it talks about what all Israel did and why Israel got in so much trouble. In the 12th year of Ahaz, who was the king of Judah, Hoshea, the son of Elah, became the king over Israel in Samaria and reigned 9 years, and he was horrible, as were most kings of Israel. Thanks, Ken. And it says he did evil in the sight of Yahweh, only not as the kings of Israel who were before him. He was worse. Shalmaneser, who was the king of Assyria, they were going to have a war, and did have a war, and Hoshea became his servant and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found out that Hoshea was trying to trick him. And he had sent messengers to another king, the king in Egypt, and had offered no tribute to the king of Assyria as he had done year by year. So he was put in prison. Then the king of Assyria invaded the whole land and went up to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. Now, in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and carried Israel away. Okay, so we're now at the end. We're like in 725, 720, somewhere around there, BC, where the nation of Israel, God's just had it with them. And so the king of Assyria captures Samaria, that was the capital, and carried Israel away to Assyria and settled them in these lands on the river of Gozan, and so on. And this came about, but here's why this came about. This is why Israel was taken into captivity. Because the sons of Israel had sinned against Yahweh Elohim, who had brought them up from the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh. But guess what? They feared other gods, and that means they worshiped other gods. They had respect for other gods. And they walked in the customs of the nations whom Yahweh had driven out before the sons of Israel. God drove them out and was going to drive the rest of them out. But Israel said, no. We kind of like what's going on here. We're going to marry into their family. They've got beautiful women and beautiful men, and in the customs of the king of Israel, which they had introduced. Okay, so the sons of Israel did things secretly, like God didn't know, which were not right against Yahweh, their Elohim. Moreover, they built for themselves high places in all their towns, from watchtower to the fortified city. And they set up sacred pillars and Asherah, which would be Asheroth, on every high hill and under every green tree. They set up these places to worship false gods, which God specifically told them not to do. And there they burned incense on all the high places, just like the nations that God had carried them away. So even though God carried these nations away, the Israelites still, it was fun. They liked it. So they did the same things that the nations had done before them, the ones that God carried away to exile, and they did evil things provoking Yahweh. They served idols. The same idols where Yahweh said, you're not going to do this. Not and be my people. Yet Yahweh warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets. We've already seen, 3 or 4 of the non-writing prophets today that have come into either Israel or Judah. Most for today, I think most of them or all of them came into Israel and said, stop! Don't do that. Yahweh warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and every seer. And by the way, I want you to note here in verse 13, it doesn't just talk about Israel. Not just talking about the northern 10. It's talking about Judah also. Yahweh warned both of them, both nations, through all his prophets and every seer, and said, quit. Turn from your evil ways. Keep my commandments, my statutes, according to all the law which I commanded your fathers, and the ones that I sent to you through my servants, the prophets. But guess what? they didn't listen. They stiffened their neck like their fathers, who did not believe in the Lord their God. Now, that's biggie right there. They didn't worship the one true God. They didn't believe the one true God. Like Jeroboam obviously didn't believe what God had told him through Ahijah. They rejected his statutes. Now, what he's doing right here is he's telling us why Israel and eventually Judah went into captivity. They rejected his statutes. They rejected his covenant, which he had made with their fathers. The covenant, if you do this, then I'll bless you. But if you don't, his warnings with which he warned them, if you don't do what I'm telling you, you're going to get taken off into captivity. And they followed their pride. And they became vain. They didn't need God. And they went after the nations which surrounded them. They started doing that stuff. They started worshiping the other nations. It was more fun. Which the nations which surrounded them, concerning which Yahweh had commanded them not to do like them. I'm going to run these people off for you. Don't do their works. But they forsook the commandments of Yahweh, their God, and made for themselves molten images and 2 calves and goats, which we know. And they made an Asherah, a grove, the place where the pagans worshipped their Elohim, their false gods. And they worshipped all the host of heaven and served Baal. Now, Baal means Lord. They worshipped the host of heaven, which God said, do not do. And they served a false God. And then, to make matters worse, they committed abortions. Now, I said it that way on purpose. They made their sons and their daughters pass through the fire. They threw them in the fire to Molech and sacrificed them and killed them. And some of their kings would build a city, and they would take their firstborn child and bury him or her in the footings, in the concrete. Then they made their sons and their daughters pass through the fire. There again, it's kind of the equivalent to abortion. And they practiced divination, witchcraft, enchantments. And they sold themselves. In other words, they prostrated themselves. They went a whoring after other gods to do evil in the sight of Yahweh, and they provoked him. Took a while, but God finally said, I've had it with these people. So Yahweh was very angry with Israel, and he moved them from his sight. Assyria, Babylon, and here's where he switches back. The writer here switches back and says that he's only dealing with the northern tribes at this particular point. None was left except the tribe of Judah. But then guess what? A couple hundred years later, Judah didn't keep the commandments of Yahweh, their Elohim, but they walked in the same customs which Israel had introduced. They looked up there, they looked at Bethel, and they looked at the fun that the Israelites were having, and they said, let's do it. But Yahweh rejected all the descendants of Israel and afflicted them and gave them in the hands of plunderers until he finally cast them out of his sight, totally. When he had torn Israel from the house of David, that goes back to Rehoboam and Jeroboam, they made Jeroboam the son of Nebat king. Then Jeroboam drove Israel away from following Yahweh and made them commit a great sin. What was the great sin? Worshipping all of these other gods. Then Jeroboam drove Israel away from following Yahweh and made them commit a great sin. The sons of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. And what were those sins? Jeroboam sinned, and he caused Israel to sin. They didn't depart from him. They were having fun. Until, and then it wasn't fun, Yahweh removed Israel from his sight, took him up into Assyria, as he had spoken through all his servants, the prophets. We're not through with these non-writing prophets. We hadn't even gotten into Elijah and Elisha, and there are other prophets along that. So what we're reading right here is something that happened after what we're going to be talking about next week. But I thought this was a good synopsis, and I thought it was worth taking a look at. So Israel was carried away into exile from their own land to Assyria. How long? Until this was written, right here. And then the king of Assyria, it's interesting. It seems like the king of Assyria knew that the lands were going fallow, that the lands needed people to work them. It says the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon and from Cuthah, I don't know how to pronounce that, and from Ava and Hamath, and anyway, and settled them in the cities of Samaria. And this is in the northern 10 tribe area, in place of the sons of Israel. They took Israel out. They put Babylonians and also Assyrians in, and hence this is where the Samaritans came from, which married into Israel, and we came up with these what they called half-breeds, half Samaritan, half Israelite, and they mixed their worshiping together. At the beginning of their living there, they didn't fear Yahweh. Well, no, because they weren't Israelites. I mean, they weren't Jews. They hadn't been trained. Therefore, Yahweh sent lions among them and killed some of them. And so they hollered at the king of Assyria and said, look, the nations whom you've carried away into exiles up in Samaria do not know the custom of the God of the land. In other words, the Samaritans that came into Israel, the northern tribes, didn't understand the custom of God. And part of the customs of God was how to take care of the land. So he sent lions among them, and behold, they kill them because they don't know the custom of the God of the land. Then the king of Assyria said, okay, we'll take one of their priests down there who you carried away into exile, and let him go and teach them the custom of the God of the land. It's interesting. The king of Assyria knew that Israel had a God that was different from the God of Assyria. So one of the priests that they carried away came and lived in Bethel and taught them how they should have respect for Yahweh. But every nation still made gods of its own. and that in this case would be 2, maybe 3 nations. It was Assyria, it was Israel, and it was Judah and Babylon. They all came into this area. They still made gods of their own and put them in the houses of the high places, which the people of Samaria had made every nation in their cities where they lived. And this is certainly not what God wanted. And the men of Babylon made Sukkoth, Beneth, the men of Cuth, whatever, and they made Negral, the men, well, I'm going to skip all of that, and the Abadites, and they burned their children in the fire to one of their gods and to another one of their gods. And they also respected Yahweh. Interesting, isn't it? That they mixed their custom, their religion of sacrificing their children, but it says they also feared and had respect for Yahweh. And they appointed among themselves priests of the high places. Same thing Jeroboam had done, who acted for them in the houses of the high places. And they feared Yahweh, but they served their own gods according to the custom of the nation. You know, we fear and respect your gods, your God, Israel. But we're going to serve our gods too, and why don't we just mix it according to the custom of the nation? So they were doing both. Wasn't improving what they were doing. And to this day, when this was written, they do according to the earlier customs. They don't fear Yahweh. They don't follow Yahweh's statutes or his ordinances or the law or the commandments which Yahweh had commanded the sons of Jacob, whom he named Israel. They weren't worshiping God. They weren't following God's instructions. They just lived in the promised land. And it says, you know, they didn't follow the commandments and so on, with whom Yahweh had made a covenant and commanded them, saying, here's what he said: don't have respect to other gods. Don't bow down to them. Don't serve them. Don't sacrifice to them. I'm telling you, folks. And he sent them prophets. And the prophets said, hey, you all are messing up. Quit. But Yahweh, who brought you up from the land of Egypt, coming out of Egypt, going to Mount Sinai, with great power and with an outstretched arm, him, capital H, him you shall fear and respect, and to him you shall bow yourselves down, and to him you shall sacrifice. And here's what you're going to do. The statutes and the ordinances and the law and the commandments which he wrote for you, you shall observe to do forever. And don't worship other gods. Don't have fear. Don't respect other gods. The covenant that I have made with you, you shall not forget, nor shall you fear other gods. Now remember, all of this is telling Israel and Judah why they're going into captivity. I made a covenant with you, and you weren't supposed to forget, and you weren't supposed to fear other gods or respect other gods. But Yahweh, your Elohim, you shall fear, not these other gods. And if you do, he'll deliver you from the hand of all your enemies. But guess what? They did not listen. But they did according to their earlier custom. So while these nations feared Yahweh, it's kind of interesting. They're mixing it up here. They had respect to the one true God, but they also served their idols and their children and their grandchildren served their idols as their fathers did, so they do to this day. That's what I've got. I thought that was a great synopsis of why Israel and eventually Judah had to go into captivity. Comments?
Yeah, basically what you just described there is that God is reminding them that the covenant is being activated. The first part of the covenant, when God says, do all these things, and Israel said, we will do as the Lord said. And then you read Deuteronomy 28, and here's the blessings and curses. Here's what's going to happen if you obey the Lord your God. And the first 15 verses tells you all the blessings that are going to come as a result. And then from verse 16 to the end of the chapter, now here's the cursings. Here's what's going to happen to you if you don't obey my voice and don't heed my word. Here's what's going to happen. And so what I think what you're showing here is God is reminding them, okay, well, this next part of the covenant is being fulfilled. These are the curses that you justly earned that Moses himself wrote down. Again, going back to the fact that you and I both believe that and understand that Moses himself was probably one of the key prophets.
Yeah.
I firmly believe that, and that God's reminding them that, hey, look, these are the curses that are part of the covenant. God is fulfilling the covenant which God made to his fathers, and so because they didn't obey, God is he's justifying his actions for what he's allowing to have happen to them. So I found that interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. He laid it out several times to his people. He sent them prophets and said, you got to stop doing this stuff. And, knowing a little bit about the mentality of the Israelites is, sure, we'll do it for a couple of weeks, and then we're going back to our old ways because, look at what these other nations are doing. That looks like so much fun. So anyway, thanks, Michael.
I thought it was interesting in that last section that you read, where the king of Assyria sent the people in to take care of the land. And then, they didn't do what they didn't recognize God, so he sent the lions. But it was just interesting that God had not departed from the land. The people had left him and been carried away, but he still considered it his portion. He was still present in the land. And you kind of look at our country today and you have to ask yourself, who is it that's left? Has God left us, or is he still present? We're just ignoring him, or we've departed from him. So I thought that was interesting that God was still, Yahweh still considered himself that land was his.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Jill, for that comment. Arthur here. I was just thinking, when you look at all of the things that happened, what is the difference in principle from then and here today? Are we not really in a similar fashion where we've, as a nation and at large, not everyone of course, but most people have abandoned the worship of God Almighty. The doctrines and teachings of people have gone way off course in many, many respects. And one wonders if, as we go through this history, are we not repeating that history right now? And is it sometime in the near future, or not the near future, will the Father take his hand off this nation and allow it to collapse?
Yeah.
Amen. Thank you. Yes, awesome.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying amen to both what Jill said and what Arthur said. And that's the one thing I appreciate, because I look at what we're doing in the studies here. A lot of Christians look at the Old Testament or what God allowed to happen to Israel, and that just applied to ancient Israel. That doesn't apply to us. And I think that that's something that we shouldn't do as Christians. because we know the scripture is given for our admonition and instruction. And it's important for us to remember that the lessons and these things that are written of old, they do apply to us. And I think that we need to be mindful of that. And you know, our church culture, not the Sabbatarian culture, but you know, Christianity in general has completely dismissed the Old Testament to the point that they don't even consider that these things that are written might have any application to us in this day and age at all. And that's a problem.
Yeah, you know, the scripture that says that you need to look at the former to know the latter end thereof. And while this isn't specifically talking about the United States of America, it should give us a little hint, you know, as to hey, wait a minute, maybe we're not doing what we ought to do, you know. And I don't think this country's going to do it. You know, Arthur mentioned, you know, that God, you know, one day is going to take his hand off of this country. I think it's already happened. I think he's I really do. I think God is letting us learn our lesson, and it's going to take the return of Jesus Christ for you know, human beings on this earth to go, oh, that's what he meant, you know. And it's going to be a while. You know, I don't know. None of us know when it's going to happen, but it's going to happen.
Well, it's interesting when you read on through the end of that chapter, you know, after they send a prophet back from Samaria to go into Bethel and teach them, and he teaches them, you know, what God requires of them. And then it goes on to say that they worshipped Yahweh, but they also served their own idols, you know, that they built their own high places and had their own practices. But it also refers to them as serving Yahweh. They worshiped the Lord in verse 32, but they also appointed all sorts of their own people to officiate. And in verse 41, even while these people were worshiping Yahweh, they were serving their idols. To this day, their children and grandchildren continue to do as their ancestors did. You know, you kind of, and it's interesting, it's just put out there that they supposedly they worship and they serve Yahweh, but they do their own thing. You know, how far has Christianity changed since since this country was established, to where we have, when they put these statistics up at times on the TV and whatever, that X number of percentage of the country claims to be Christian, you kind of go, really? Because I'm not seeing it, you know? So you have to wonder, you know, and yet God seemed to, he tolerated it, at least at that point in time. He allowed it to be that way. So yeah, it's just interesting to me that it's stated that they both worshipped and served Yahweh, and yet they clearly didn't in big portions of their belief and what they did. So, and it's a lot that way today. I mean, I have friends who are claim to be Christians and whatever, but they just can't get past the gay marriage thing. You know, they've got friends or relatives who are gay, and they cannot speak about it the way God does, you know. And yet in every other way, they perform with the heart of a Christian. So it's just an interesting anomaly.
Yeah, we've got a couple of that's good. You're exactly right, and that's where we are right now.
Yeah, Barb and Mike Kelly have, I think that's Mike Kelly, have two comments. Are you able to read those, Skip?
Go ahead.
Yeah, Barb says, so one may fear God and still serve other gods. obviously I think that we've seen that for much of my life, that, at least in this country, you have people that, as Jill said, claim Christianity, but still, because of diversity or because we're going to be tolerant, still follow traditions which are not biblical, or don't follow Christianity, or all paths lead, to heaven type of stuff. And then Mike Kelly says, so serving God and serving evil. Too many today try and do this, and I'd have to agree. And of course, ancient Israel did that. They combine the worship of Yahweh, the Most High, with the traditions around them, which God forbade them. Don't do this, and they did it anyway.
Yeah, in effect, don't you become a Samaritan?
Yeah.
I mean,
Jim Williams, your mic was on. You had a comment. I didn't mean to step on your toes there with the chats.
I was just thinking, and we've grown up expecting, or many of us have, certainly previously expecting Jesus would certainly be here by now. And who knows, it may be a lot longer. And maybe we could pray for a better king that might help return us to God.
well, that's true. But if you're going to do that, Jim, you got to pray for 435 new kings?
Yeah. I mean, we need the Senate and the House and so on, but a good leader can get a lot to follow him. I mean, not everybody, but a nation can repent. Just a thought. I don't expect it either.
Nineveh did.
Pardon?
Nineveh did.
Yeah. So why not us?
Well, where are the prophets to go to the people and speak boldly? I mean, that should be the role of some people within the church. I mean, obviously you have Billy Graham and you have, some of the other big names out there, but I mean, are they preaching the hard truth? In some way, when you look at what the prophets here did, what you're presenting, Skip, is there's a consistency that God gives his word to his servants, the prophets. And what are they doing? They're going to the leadership, or they're going to the people, and they're giving them a warning. Listen, you've got to stop this, or else this is going to happen. As a warning. Well, where is the church doing that? Where are you having? I mean, you have here and there, a little bit here, a little bit there, a couple of people on a podcast, on a website, and what's happening to them right now? Other Christians are telling them to shut up, be quiet. We're going to deplatform you. You can't say that. But and everyone's in fear of what the state of the government's going to do to shut us down. We need to be righteously angered and bolded and still speak the truth, because the end result is going to be the same as it was for ancient Israel. If we don't, cry aloud the warning and, quote unquote, if God inspires us to be a prophet, as it were. Now, I'm not claiming to be a prophet or that we should all be prophets, but we have the word of the Lord. It's in our hands. Skip did the study out of it. The principles and applications in there apply today as much as they did then. Where is our courage and strength to speak the truth to whoever it is we come in contact with that may be misguided by the sins of our fathers and the culture that we live in? Anyway, I'm sorry, I'm going on a rant. Go ahead, Mark. I didn't mean to step on your toes.
Who are the priests today? What did Jesus do? Did he call us to be, what did he call us to be? Scripture says he made us a kingdom, priests to God and Father. Who should be doing these things? This is part of what we ought to do, is be messengers of God to whomever we come into contact with at the appropriate, correctly. We got to accept it that we have to have a hand in this.
Yeah.
This isn't going to be accomplished by national media. You know what would happen in national media? Now it gets shut down. This is a hand-to-hand combat with every one of us.
That's true. That is true. And we've learned to sit on our backsides and not do anything. And I think the word is getting out more now, what you just said, Mark, that there is something for us to do. Cry loud, spare not.
Michael's got the advantage because he's got the lightsaber.
Yeah. Well, we have the Word of God. That's our lightsaber.
That's exactly right, Michael. And everyone, we all come. Mike said a great truism right there. We have the sword, and we all come into contact with people. The way we live, the way we speak, and what we say should be testimonies to those that we come into contact with.
Amen to what you said, Mark. And just one thing that came to mind as you were talking, and I've read this from so many people and I hear it expounded on. Look, folks, we are not voting ourselves out of tyranny. There's not going to be a political solution that's going to bring about what we were. It's not going to happen. It doesn't work that way. What happens? You have to change the spiritual nature of the people. The only way to do that is to say to the people, "This is the way. Walk in it." And that requires pointing out what they're doing wrong. If you guys want to go back to prosperity, then you have to change the way you're doing things. Stop, like Skip says, do a 180. The military, stop, halt, turn around, go the other direction. And that requires somebody to act as these prophets that we're reading, saying, look, you're doing a great sin. This is wrong. And here's what's going to happen as a result of you doing this. If you don't stop and turn around. And you don't hear a lot of that. But as Mark said, that's our job. That's our role. And we're well equipped to do that at this time because some of us know the scriptures a lot better than others. And we have the ability to point people in the right direction.
That's true.
Be careful with that.
I think sometimes one of the difficult things is that, when Jesus told the disciples they were to become fishers of men, and then you look at the scripture, I think it's in Ecclesiastes, about casting your bread upon the waters, that your job is to throw stuff out there and it sinks below the surface and you don't always see what's fed by what you have thrown out there. Even in Ecclesiastes, it says, and after many days it may come back to you. But the implication is that, and we're just human enough that we like to get feedback and response and results from stuff that we do. And it gets discouraging sometimes if you feel like you keep, throwing stuff out there and to no avail. But I think, you kind of have to look at, if we're imaging God, what is he doing? He's throwing love out there every day and knowledge of him and opportunities for wisdom, and he's not seeing much result, long term, but he keeps doing it. So, we need to be encouraged that every little bit that we do, that we cast out there, is imaging God and what he's doing in dealing with humans. So.
Well, knowing the big picture, we shouldn't be discouraged. Where our instructions are to plant and water. And we know that the word of God does not return void. And as we've discussed many times, we know that there's that great resurrection coming. So whatever we plant and water now may not germinate in this age. It may come up later. And so, all on God's timing. So that's still that's still our function, our role. We still plant and water, and God brings the increase. And it may not be in this age because the individual may not have the heart or strength to be able to withstand this world, this culture, and Satan the devil, and they may only have to overcome themselves in the future. And that's also an encouraging note, so we still have a job to do, folks.
Yes,
even
Mike.
in the midst of a lawless culture.
As I've heard all of the comments thus far, we don't come down with anything specific. And I've faced this for the last several years since leaving the organization I once was part of for nearly 60 years, and stepped out because clearly the teachings and approach that I perceived from the past organization were not right, and they were not willing to really openly discuss them and so forth. So I became a pariah. So here I am in a community, my wife and I, and homeowners association. We've got very, very good neighbors. The neighbor next door, I won't mention names, but she is a very good Christian, church on Sunday and all the rest of it. I floated an idea to her and she didn't pick up on it. Have neighbors across the street, another widow, there's two widows, and it's very, very clear that she is not interested at all, despite the fact that her husband died in the bed and the police were knocking on my door would I come over if she wanted help. So I went over and she was in a state of shock, and I ended up organising everything for her, did the funeral, did the speaking and all the rest of it. Never another word from her about that. And so, you cast your bread on still waters and you just have to let it lie there, as was mentioned before. And it has to be that it's a combination of, I think, circumstances and where someone is willing to ask you the question. And if they're not willing to do that because of your behavior, because of your attitude, because of how you keep your house, whatever, then there's not a calling. And that's what I've come down to. It's not an institutional thing. It's an individual witnessing, and people have to recognize that. And then if they want to, acknowledge it and ask the question.
Yeah, I think Arthur's right, and the truth is that it's going to be different for each and every one of us because we all live in different circumstances, have different amounts of contact with people and opportunities and different ways in which we can express those kindnesses, whether it's words or whether it's food or whether it's a smile or whether it's whatever, encouragement, I think the key is that we just don't stop doing whatever it is as it comes our way, as the opportunity comes our way.
Yeah, if I may use an example, we just had new neighbours move in next door to us just a few weeks ago, and family, children, and I don't talk about anything. I'm polite and so forth. And one day there was a knock on the door, and the favour was asked of me. There was going to be a parcel at the front door. Would I take it in and so forth and keep it for them, which I did. And then the next step was, oh, well, look, here's our combination to our garage. Will you take our trash out and put it on the fit? And the next thing was, and so trust has been established and confidence has been established, and still said nothing. But the groundwork is being laid, I think, and it's up to the father and his son to move them to the point where they will say, well, what did you used to do for work or whatever, to open the door for a conversation. Oops, what happened?
We're listening.
Oh, the Sunday went blank.
I'm talked out.
Sorry.
Yeah, but you did, Skip. You did a really, really good job with the study, and I like the approach, the way you're giving historical context, and you're doing it in a way that's really helping us get a grasp on. And so as we get into these individual prophets, we go into reading, the writing prophets, and you read them. I think that you're setting a great foundation for us.
Thanks.
I appreciate that. And with the work you're putting into this, I know it's pretty lengthy. One other thought that I had earlier that just came back to my mind. I'm getting more senior moments, and you all folks are older than I am. You're probably laughing at me. Can you go back to the slide where you list the 7 sins or the 7 things that Jeroboam did that were evil? You got numbers next to them. You listed all 7 things, and I don't remember where that was.
Yeah, I'll get it in a second. It was early on.
Yeah, it was earlier in the study. It wasn't real early, but it was. Yeah, here you go. These things here. As you went through this, and okay, these 6 things. What popped up in my head again? Because I look at everything as far when I look at Scripture, especially the Old Testament and the New. I look at how this applies to me, how this applies to us today. It's not, this isn't ancient history that doesn't apply or have any impact on us. And I was looking at this, and the one thing that popped in my head was, those of us that come from the Church of God culture, when there's a discussion about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, we kind of look at that, at least we were trained and taught, that this is kind of a cycle. The 4 horsemen are a cycle of false religion or false messiahship, going out, to conquer. Then there's war, then there's pestilence, disease, and then death. And this is a cycle that repeats itself. As you were going through these 6 things, what popped in my head was, this is another cycle of what happens to republics or nations that are blessed by God. And here's a pattern that gets established where after their prosperity, they start. Number one is they allow other ideologies or other religions or other beliefs, and they give them space to be practiced in their land. And these are things that may be anathema to the foundations that they were established as. And then 2, then they allow their own people, or they give them deference or preference to follow these other ideologies, these other forms of worship. And then they come out and say, well, it doesn't harm us. All paths lead to the same place. We all worship the same God, type of thing. And then you get, obviously number 3, houses of worship in high places in many spots. And that could be, it doesn't even have to be Christian or Jewish or Hindu or other religious worship. You could have statism involved in this as well. And then obviously then you have priests from families other than Levi. You have people that make them assume they're the leadership. They hold the mantle of morality, whatever it is that they've perverted themselves into. Obviously changing the dates of the feasts and other holy days. They make holidays unto themselves. I mean, we're getting rid of Columbus Day. I mean, I'm trying to tie this into our culture also. We're not having the traditions where we honored those sacrifices and those traditions that formed us. We're getting rid of Columbus Day. They want to get rid of the 4th of July. Now we have Juneteenth. We have other days that they want to establish. And then the last ones, what really raised my hair on my head was, and this always happens with the state, then they make themselves out to be gods.
When
that happens, you get to the point where then they have to force everybody to worship and share the same ideology, and no dissent is tolerated. So I looked at these 6 things and I saw a pattern. At least that's how I saw it. And I just thought I'd share those thoughts. Don't know if that helps or hinders anyone, but I just saw that there's a lot of consistency in the way mankind's nature is. It hasn't changed. And these are things we're watching take place amidst our own society, even though we're reading about these are things that happened in ancient Israel that caused them to be utterly destroyed and removed. And that's why, someone has to cry a lot of warning. We're going to end up in the same boat if we're not on that path already, which we very well may be.
Yeah.
Thanks for letting me rant.
Good point. Good points. All right.
Well, it points to the fact that we see it in in everything from creation through everything we do, that things move in cycles and in circles. I mean, you know, you look at the universe, our galaxy and whatever, everything works in circles, and every, you know, whether it's a day or a month or a year or whatever it is, it goes around, and it's almost like each circle you have the opportunity to make it different if you want to in some ways, but also the fact that life, you know, even is it the Lion King movie with the big song, The Circle of Life?
Yeah.
And then if you've read the book, The Fourth Turning,
Yes.
that deals with the circle of life as far as society and culture, you know, and those patterns. I think God has put patterns in everything, you know, even when you just look at little pieces of the creation. There's something called the Fibonacci design. It's used in the art world, but it appears in all kinds of small elements of things that are created, whether it's shells or leaves or tree rings, and just that circular kind of repeating spiral that is existent in tiny little things, but it also seems to expand into everything, who we are, how we operate, you know, how we think. And, you know, the fourth turning, Michael, made me think about that, because I've read that several times, you know, about history repeating itself, and how that circular motion and the things that are inherent in that affect the generations differently depending on where in that cycle you happen to be born. It affects the kind of people that grow up in that particular cycle, and then that in turn affects the way the big cycle overall works out. And it's there's no real answers to it. It's just interesting to recognize that it's there, it does exist. Humanity seems to do that, you know. You get that with the kings, like you, Skip, said at the beginning. You get, you know, 2 or 3 bad kings, then you get a good king, and then you get 2 or 3 bad kings, and it's like it goes round and around and around, and we repeat our behaviors. And it'd be nice to think that, you know, you would gradually draw closer to God, which I'm sure is the ultimate goal. But it's just one of those interesting things to read about, as to how many areas of life and the universe that you can see that circular pattern taking place.
That's true. Even in spiritual aspects, circular things. What's the name of the spiritual creature that's rings and it's got eyeballs around it? As you were talking, Jill, that just popped in my head. Like, yeah, even in the spiritual realm, there's rings and circular things. There's even creatures that are described. I can't remember.
Is that like the wheels within the wheels?
Yeah. It's like, okay, is you know, but when I first came in, when I was first coming out of atheism, reading that, I was like, okay, this whoever wrote this book was on an acid trip, you know. But yeah, I remember reading that there's wheels within wheels and eyeballs around the wheels. So there's even, I think, in the spiritual realm, there's a circular, spherical aspect to the spiritual realm as well. At least that's how it was written down. Which is interesting that you bring up the whole idea of cycles. And yeah, amen. I've read The Fourth Turning, and we're in one right now. If I had to guesstimate based on what's happening, and of course, you know, Fourth Turnings, you know, World War II, the end of World War II, you know, things that come out the other side of a fourth turning are completely different than they were before you entered it. And I think we're in that period where the world's going to be very different when we get through whatever this total upheaval and chaos we're in the midst of, and not good for us, you know, given the fact we've seemed like ancient Israel, we've abandoned the foundations, the cornerstones that held us in place for the better part of, you know, 250 years. And that, by the way, is the average lifespan of a republic, is a little over 200 years. And we're at the very end of it. And of course, that's because the generations forget. You know, like we've read today in this Skip read, The children and grandchildren are walking in the errors of their grandparents that were established that were never corrected. And then greater and greater evil is done at that point. And then we accept the greater and greater evil, and then we change the morality completely at that point. And no one is permitted to dissent or have a different viewpoint. And that's just the way this cycle goes.
Michael, one of the things you said just then put a thought in my head, and I don't know that I've ever really thought about it before, but well, I guess I have. Looking back at ancient Israel, and then you could bring it forward to today, but I'm going to go back just and talk about ancient Israel. What about the people who were obeying God, but were living in this pagan nation? And they were seeing all of this stuff, and they were probably being abused by their neighbors, or maybe the law enforcement or whatever. But what a miserable place to be is someone who is trying their best to obey God, living in a pagan land. That'd be tough.
Yeah, you could talk to Prasad and the brethren in India about that, but they do it.
Yeah, true. Good point.
Well, I think we were talking about it. I don't know if it was Mark and I, or whether it was on the study last week about people in Sodom and Gomorrah, although it says there weren't any righteous people. But it is apparent that God allows the righteous to suffer as a consequence of the evil that's around them. He doesn't always spare everybody, because he has a much bigger plan than what we see. We tend to focus on how we feel and how we're being treated now in this life. And you have to remind yourself that God's plan is so much bigger than that. And if you have to go down as part of the defeat of evil in order that his plan can take place, then that's okay. It's kind of like Paul said, he'd just as soon leave now and go be with the Lord, but he's willing to suffer for the sake of everybody else, so it's all part of the plan.
Yeah, we've got a pretty good reward down the road, but it's not here yet.
Right, that's true. Joe, tying into your thoughts, speaking of prophets, looking into different, even the book of Amos, which I'm looking at, that's another prophet we'll eventually get to at some point down the road. There's a proclamation, I think, in there where God announces that the righteous are going to perish, that no one in Israel is going to escape the judgment that God is going to pronounce, because the judgment is righteously deserved. Even those that are righteous and didn't bow the knee to Baal, they still go into the judgment with the rest of the nation. Look at Jeremiah. Here's a man who spent his entire life warning Israel what was going to happen to them if they didn't shape up. And then God says, oh, by the way, you get to go into captivity with them. And which, again, sometimes that makes me scream in my human, is that's so unfair. I've followed God. I suffered for it. My own people wanted to kill me for speaking the word of the Lord. And now I have to suffer along. And God's answer is yes.
Elijah is a good example of that too.
Yeah. And I think that we've been affected by the Joel Osteen's, prosperity gospel to a point that not that we accept it, but it's somehow seeped into our back of our minds that God is going to somehow always save us out of the judgments that are going to happen to everyone else. And Scripture does not support that. As I think Isaiah says, the people don't even question, why are the righteous dying? Why are so many of God's own people dying and being removed? And God says in Isaiah, I think, Skip, you read this at one point in one of your studies, said, well, the reason this happens is because they're being taken out of the way, and they're dying because they're being saved from greater evil that is yet to come. But God, pronounces judgment, said, but you're not even asking, why am I allowing all the righteous to perish? So that's something else to keep in mind as we go through these times of trouble that we're in right now, is that, maybe God isn't going to save us out of this, but it's all going to serve the greater purpose in the end.
Yep. All right. Anybody else?
Oh,
Isn't it in the book of Peter where he says, don't think it strange that these fiery trials will be sent, counted as a blessing?
Yeah. Yeah, there's a real cute movie. I can't remember the name of it. The In-Laws or something like. It's not the In-Laws, but it's something like that, where this young lady has gone to church for the first time in her life, and the minister reads that we should consider our trials a blessing, and she raised her hand in church and said, "Well, that doesn't make any sense to me, but if that's true, I've got a whole lot of blessings coming." So, but anyway, yeah, it takes a while to prepare this, but I'm telling you, folks, I'm having a ball, a blast, going through the. I haven't been through Kings in a long time, Kings and Chronicles, and I've really, really enjoyed it. So, thank you all for letting me do it.
Thanks for doing that, Skip.
Oh, I just love it. It's really good, and I hope I'm going in the right direction. I've asked a couple of you, I guess, because there's so much historical information that we need to give surrounding these prophets, and but anyway, and
I think you've been inspired to do it the right way. I'm thoroughly digging this simply because we're not just diving in to a prophet without understanding. You're setting a great foundation for us, I think, Skip, and I think you're being inspired to do it that way, and I appreciate it.
well,
Yeah, without the historical context, it just doesn't make sense anyway. So I think you're doing very well.
well, thank you,
I
thank you.
agree.
I'm,
I
I'm
agree.
not I'm not fishing for compliments, folks, but I do appreciate your comments, but
You're doubting. We don't want you to doubt. We don't want you to doubt. Just go with confidence with how you're doing this because it's good.
okay, well, good, good. Um, I've only got about 10,000 words left in my notes for our study of the non-writing prophets, and so we got another couple of weeks probably on the non-writing prophets, and then no telling how much time we'll spend on the writers. We're still about 200 years away from the first writing prophets in where we are right now, talking about Jeroboam and them. Because the first,
So that's why you don't count Moses.
well, you're right. You're right. You're right. I count Moses and uh, Samuel and those guys as writing prophets. But
I want to hear you expound for a whole. Now we've been going on 3 hours. I want to hear you expound for 3 hours on Enoch.
yeah, thanks a lot. There's what, 2 sentences about him.
Well, there's supposedly a whole book, so I don't know if you're going to go that route or not.
Yeah, yeah. Well, no. There is some said about Enoch. Jude talks about him, and he was a prophet, but he's not considered one by those guys.
Well, the commentators don't consider Moses a prophet either, and I disagree with them.
Yep, I do too. Well, all right. Anything else? We'll do part 3 next week. We've got a chat there. Barb said good study. Well, thanks. I appreciate it.